And we're live. David, thanks for joining us. How are you getting on today, mate?
I'm doing good, Ryan. How are you?
Not doing too bad. Do you know, we're currently in a heat wave right now in the UK, and it is swelteringly hot over here. It's horrible.
I was going to mention it. It's like I'm in Florida, so it was over 100 today.
100. What's that? That's Fahrenheit, because you crazy guys over the pond like to do this in Fahrenheit. We're sensible and do it in Celsius. What's that in Celsius? You know?
It's untranslatable because Celsius is like linear B. I mean, it's like this old archaic. Everything rounds to 10. We don't even understand it over here.
We've just found out how to confuse an American. Tell them to convert Fahrenheit to Celsius. There you go. You'll have a laugh.
Yep.
But yeah, so we're pushing about 30 degrees Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. I don't know, about 500 or something like that. I don't know. But it's really uncomfortable. It's the British heat, David. This is the thing. You come over to everyone I talk to who's that I speak to abroad. I've got a lot of friends that live in different countries. They're like, 25 degrees, that's nothing. That's nothing. I'm like, no, you don't understand. 25 degrees in the UK is basically like 70 degrees in other countries. That's so uncomfortable. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. I know your water boils at 100, right, and freezes at 0. Makes no sense whatsoever.
It does. It's nice and easy to follow. We could go into this. We could literally start off a massive
32 and 212. That's what I deal with, but I just know it. So
That's it. But David, I've been dying to get you on. As soon as you got in touch with this sort of thing, your team got in touch with us about the subject we're going to be having a chat about. I am so excited to have this. This is right up my street. I love all this sort of like kind of old school, like kind of history and kind of, I wouldn't say a conspiracy, but like kind of myths and all that sort of stuff. But you're right knee deep into it, aren't you?
Yeah, well, I am, and it's interesting when I waded into these waters, I had no idea that many people hold views that they are more married to than their political views, than their religious views. I mean, people believe very certain things. So, you come in and you say this or you say that, and you're going to find there's camps. And I was just shocked at how much passion there is. It's a wonderfully fun topic. I mean, Atlantis, right? And ancient civilizations and all of that. It's a very passionate space.
It is. I did a little bit of research on this myself, actually, because I said, right, I've got an expert on. I need to do a little bit of research. I know of it, but I said, right, I'll get into it. I mean, if people are listening, they don't know much about Atlantis and what it's all about. It's literally, it really came from back in, God knows, back in ancient Greece. Am I right? Was it Plato was the one that really kind of talked more about it? But what really fascinated me about that is that the story he did, he kind of stopped. He didn't really finish it, did he?
Well, you talk about conspiracy theories. Did he finish it and it's just not available to us, or was it not finished? Because it stops. It'd be like watching Star Wars, and then Luke Skywalker fires the torpedoes at the Death Star and it stops. It's like, well, what happened? We just got to the good part, where it stops. King Atlas is about ready to give a big old speech, and the speech is going to tie everything together and kind of explain what's been going on. And you're right, just to get into it real quick. So the only historical source we have for Atlantis is Plato. If you hear anything else, it's not what they call a primary source. So people wrote about it all throughout history, but they were all pretty much basing it on his account. Now there are other hints of it, which is one of the things I call out in the book and in the work that I did. But everything starts with Plato, and he wrote Timaeus and Critias, which are the two dialogues that specifically mentioned Atlantis. And then he have other dialogues like Laws and stuff, where he mentions, next time the world gets wiped out, maybe we should put a government together this way or that way, or kind of stuff. But Plato is the place to start, and then you can kind of work your way out from there. Academically, I guess. Academics don't like this topic.
But the thing is I think it's really strange the way when they discuss it about Plato, he doesn't really he doesn't really describe himself as what he says is real. He describes it as like it kind of dabbles in the fiction. Is it real? Is it not real? It's up to you to decide, and it's pretty funny. He kind of trolled us before even trolling was a thing.
Well, to get into that's interesting. I think we live in a world, we have this term misinformation, and so I hate to use a term like that associated with this. Let's call it gobbledygook and crap. How about that? How about crap?
I
There's
like
a
that.
bunch
I
of
like that.
crap, yeah, that is laid on this. When I open the conversation on this, what I tell people is, look, first off, Atlantis, it's been beaten to death. It's absolutely been beaten to death. You can go find anything you want about it. There are books written that says Atlantis was the moon, right? Or Atlantis is the feelings that you have as you make friends through life, and it's just absolute nonsense. It had nothing to do with Plato.
Yeah.
Um, what he did, he wrote down. Here's what he says. So Plato does a couple things. Sometimes, because who was Plato? Let's start with that.
Mm.
He was a ancient Greek pseudo. I'm going to call him a historical philosopher. He wouldn't have thought he was either of those terms. Today we view him as a philosopher. But that's not what he thought he was doing. What he was trying to do was capture things about his society and rationalize them and try and make sense of them. But also, from a history standpoint, he actually recorded conversations. So you get into other historians, and they kind of tell you what happened, and they might dialogue out, a great speech by a great leader before, rah rah, we're going to go fight the Persians or whatever. But Plato tried to capture dialogues of his primary teacher, Socrates, who these are names that we all know. And Plato does some interesting things. So he's very upfront. So in some dialogues, he says, like the Republic, which is one of his more famous ones, he has an allegory called the cave. And he says stuff like, okay, I'm trying to explain these forms to you and the way I'm looking at stuff. So imagine if you were in a cave, and imagine this and imagine that. But that's not what he says about Atlantis. He's actually meticulous, and this is some of the misinformation, or whatever term you want, the crap, whatever term you want to use, is what he actually says is this guy Critias has a written document from his great great grandfather, or it might be great 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 grandfather, Solon, who went to Egypt in 600 BC and sat with the priests and talked about all kinds of stuff. And Solon's famous. We know he's a real historical character. He was one of the early Greek politicians. And then they start talking about this ancient civilization. What the Egyptians were trying to explain to Solon was that you Greeks, you're kind of arrogant people at this point. You think a lot of yourselves, but you have no idea. You actually used to be a lot better. And then it goes into the story, and the story is that this Atlantis group of people kind of took over and invaded parts of Europe, parts of Libya, and Egypt, and the only ones to stop them were these ancient Greeks. Now, we're back like 9,000 BC is when this story takes place. So, if we had an academic with us, we would now have to spend 4 years arguing if these folks were even Greeks. That doesn't matter. It is what it is. But so Solon wrote it down, and this guy Critias read it and committed it to memory. And this is how, when they were young, this is how they learned. You had the epic poems, the Iliad, the Odyssey. You had writings, things that were written down, and then you learned, right, the thought behind it and kind of all of that. So, and Plato tells us, he says, this, I believe, well, he didn't say I believe, Critias says this is a true story, and all the people in the dialogue say, we agree.
Right.
Now, many historians are saying Plato was so clever and so smart that is so advanced that he said that because he meant exactly the opposite. And one of the things I say in the book is, look, we got to deal with, we got to believe him, right?
Yeah.
If he says it's true, we'll assume it's true. If he says it's an allegory, we'll assume it's an allegory. So again, you got to put all that aside, I think, and then kind of go back and look at, which is what I do in the book, and then kind of start from the beginning and say, what does he say, and can we verify it? And that's kind of what I've done in Atlantis Solved in this book.
Right, okay. So it's like, how would you, I mean, you go through all this sort of kind of research and all that sort of stuff. You've had countless and countless and countless people trying to kind of say different theories and different sort of like kind of depictions of where it is and how it became underwater. Is it underwater, or then is it underground? Is it before Troy? Is it after Troy? Is Troy real? And it goes all this sort of kind of. It seems like a little bit of like a hornet's nest full of information. I mean, what was your sort of like kind of understanding of that? Where did you start, and how did you really get to grips with everything? Really?
Yeah. So what I did, so my background, I have a doctorate in engineering. I've got multiple master's degrees. I'm an engineer at a company called Geospace Labs. So I know what we would call today methodologies and all the bullshit way that engineers and stuff get stuff done. And I was watching YouTube. You and I, we talked about YouTube before this,
Yeah,
and there's this guy Jimmy Corsetti, and he has this channel called Bright Insight. And in 2018, and he's an ex-U.S. Army vet. In 2018, he found this thing called the Richat Structure, which is in Mauritania, which just sounds cool, by the way,
it does sound cool.
which is in West Africa. It's in the middle of the Sahara Desert, basically. And when you look at it, he looked at it and he's like, and he's not a historian, but he's like, that's not, it looks like Atlantis. Because when you look at it, it's got exactly what we think of when we walk into it. It's got a center island, and then it's got two concentric rings of land and water. So it's like, okay, well, it's the only place on the planet ever in the history of the universe that has that configuration in a meaningful way that isn't a story, right? We can actually see it. So then but there's all kinds of, again, there's all kinds of noise on top of that. And then there's a counter group. I mentioned there were groups. In the U.S. we have Democrats and Republicans politically.
Yeah,
In Atlantis we have the Richat structure, which is also called the Eye of the Sahara. We have that camp, and then we have the Azores Island camp. And the Azores Islands are a really nice set of islands, kind of directly, not quite halfway between Europe and the U.S., almost straight out from the Strait of Gibraltar. So what happens is one of these camps will come up with a neat way of looking at it, and the other camp will then come in and try and destroy and poo-poo it and squash it and mush it
yeah.
down and all of that. So I kind of found, I stumbled into all of this, and I'm like, well, I like this topic. Look, I watch Ancient Aliens. I dig podcasts like Walk the Line. I like this stuff.
Love it.
So I'm like, let me see if I can figure it out. I'm not a genius, but I'm not a dumb guy. And I said, I mentioned Atlantis has been beaten to death. I started like everyone else. You start reading. What do people tell you? What do they tell you? What do they tell you? And the first thing you discover is it can be anything you want it to be, and you can
Yeah.
find someone who will pat you on the head and tell you that's what it is. So, yeah, no, they will. So you push all that aside and you say, let's do it for real. So what's the source? Because I didn't even really know that Plato was the only source. He's the only primary source for this thing. Now that's used as a criticism too, by the way, because they say, well, if this was such a big deal, why doesn't people talk about it? So I'm like, okay, fair enough. So let's look at what Plato said, and then let's come up with what I'm going to call requirements, right?
Okay.
And a lot of what he gives us are measurements. So I'm like, okay, well that's cool. Let's look at the measurements, and then when we come up with our assumptions or rules or whatever, the rules are we can't assume that Plato's an idiot or making stuff up. We can't assume the Greeks were idiots. We can't assume the Egyptians were idiots. We can't assume the Ottomans were idiots.
Yeah.
And let's take it all at face value and see what happens. And I went in to say, can I verify the Azores Islands or this Richat structure? Because those were, and I did a poll on Reddit. I asked, I got pretty good, like 1,100 people responded in one of the alternate history forums. And I said,
Wow.
what do y'all, what do you think Atlantis is? And there was like 6 things they thought it was. And I said, okay, of these 6, everyone vote. And by far, it was the Richat Structure, Eye of the Sahara was one, and then about 10% behind it was the Azores Islands. So I said, let's look. Let's go in systemically and systematically and look. And that's what I did.
Wow. So it's probably the best way really to do it, sort of thing. It's such an engineering mind and such an engineering sort of like way of doing things. It's so systematic, and I would say it's probably the best way of doing it. To be quite honest with you, just to get that sort of like kind of ticking all the boxes, looking at it from an outside point of view, sort of thing, and then just looking at the facts and just seeing it from like the outside in. I would, yeah, I was gonna say it's probably the best way to do it.
Yeah, well, you have to. Otherwise, you wind up in Harry Potter land, because you can be very entertained. You can have a lot of fun. You can read a lot of good stories. You can choose to believe this or that, but you don't really know, right?
Yeah.
So I went through Plato, and I do in the book. I'm meticulous about this. I pull everywhere in the dialogues out. He mentions this thing, and I list all those out so a person can read those. And then I go through each one, and anywhere there's a measurement or something that could be verified, I pull that out, identify it. And then once we have all those, I organize them, and then I said, here are our requirements. So And we've got a couple things to deal with. We're dealing with a translated document, right? Where I speak English. Um, you kind of speak English sometimes.
Sometimes
So
depends how many drinks I've had.
exactly. But it wasn't written in English. It was written in a pre-Greek or Greek language. Um, so we've got that to deal with, and then inside the translation, we've got some measurements. And so we have to figure all that stuff out. I won't go into all the details here, but in the book I'm meticulous about how do you figure that out. So they use this thing called a stadia, which is 607 feet. Okay,
Right.
now that which is the Alexandrian measure, and I've had every argument you can on this purposely because I got to test my theory. And so many people say, well, you can't know that Plato knew the Alexandrian measure. And it's like, well, of course he did. People don't know this, but Plato died in like 340 BC, and Alexander was born like 12 years before that. So they didn't know each other necessarily, although Aristotle, who was Plato's student, then taught Alexander the Great. But we're in a period where we can trust if they say, what was that crazy thing you use, Celsius, something like that? If they
Celsius,
say
yeah,
what Celsius is,
the proper measurement, yep.
I think that's a drink. But yeah, but so anyway, so I said, okay, let's just take this as a hard, cold fact, and let's say it is 607 feet. Let's see what he says, and then so you go through, and there's like 20 measurements you got to meet, and it's some cool stuff. Like one of the things he says is a center island with rings around it. Okay, well, which do we have that in the Azores, or do we have that in this Richat thing? Well, we have it on the Richat thing. We don't have it in the Azores. He says there's a city, there's a continent, and then there's a kingdom. And he actually goes into great detail around the
Right.
kingdom. He says there are 9 provinces, and each province, and that's what he calls them, provinces. Each province is run by the by a set of 5 twins. So there's King
Was that
Atlas who runs a city.
was
Then you
this
get
was this obviously the theory? Just to kind of jump in, is this the theory like they're related to kind of Poseidon sort of thing? Is this the coming from that sort of thing? If that's like the kind
well,
of
it's
myth,
funny you bring Poseidon's mentioned in this thing,
because
and I won't go into yeah,
yeah, I was just going to say, just because what I've the research I've been doing is obviously you mentioned the provinces and it's the twins and it's they're all kind of they're like kind of I don't know if they're I think they're the sons of Poseidon or something to do with him. He was the one who made them, and it
yeah,
was they had a pact together that none of them would invade each other, and if anyone did become
that's it.
like some sort of like a wronging, they'd all band together and kick the shit out of them, sort of thing. And then you mentioned obviously Atlas. There was like the main guy. He was like he brought Atlantis, what would be into Atlantis as the best of the whole lot of them, sort of thing. And even was it?
Yeah,
I'm sure that I'm sure I'm just basically showing off now. And even Zeus said that Atlantis was like the pinnacle and the utopia of the world at the time.
yeah, okay. Everything you said factually is actually accurate. What's in the
Wait,
dialogue? There wasn't too much. There was a little bit of self-aggrandizing. But so, for example, one of the things he says is the eldest of the fifth set of twins he is named Azores. And he
oh,
runs the diving islands. So I'm like, whoa, geez, okay, shit. I'm trying to figure out if Azores is Atlantis. Well, no, it doesn't fit in any way. But he tells us it's not. He gives us the name for it. And phonetically, there's like I said, there's 9 um, provinces mentioned. I've lined about 4 of them up where I think I can phonetically figure out where they are.
right,
But you mentioned Poseidon because Poseidon's mentioned in this, and it said that the city, the structure that the city was on, was made by Poseidon, and I think it says in a day and a night. But I'm not positive about that. But Poseidon liked the daughter of somebody, and he made this thing. And one of the arguments against this Richat structure thing is it's probably naturally formed. To which my argument, my back has always been, well, unless you're telling me Poseidon's this guy going around digging holes. I mean, Poseidon's like, the god of the water. And he's actually the god of kind of our plane, land, and the sea, and volcanoes, and all that stuff, which is what they think this thing,
okay,
how it originally formed. Yeah. But yeah, it says Poseidon is the one who did he made the geography for it, basically, is what Plato
right,
tells us. And that's in Critias. Yeah. So,
right,
so you look at this, and what and it's just let me give you some basic rundowns. So, it says that it has mountains in the north, and it opens to the south. Well, this Rishat thing has mountains to the north, and it opens to the south. It says that it's on a gently sloping plain of 3,000 stadia, right? And it gently slopes to the sea. Okay. Well, if you go look at the map on Google Earth of Mauritania, and then you measure how far this Richat thing is from the sea, it's like not close. That comes out to 350 miles.
Where's
Now,
Mauritania
for us,
right now?
miles is a unit of measure.
Whereabouts is Mauritania?
West Africa.
West Africa,
West
right?
Africa.
Okay.
Yeah, basically, it's the Sahara Desert. Is
So, oh,
basically
so
Mauritania.
that's what
Um,
you're kind of looking at, is like the whole Sahara sort of thing is what you're looking at right now.
Yeah, but
Right.
it's too. If you look at Africa, got the west side and kind of curves around. Maybe looks like a nose a little bit. It's
Mm-hmm.
that piece right in the middle.
Yeah.
If you zoom in at all in Africa on a map, you'll see it right there. But yeah, right now it's inhospitable. There's not much there. There's some coastal things that go on. And by the way, since we're talking about a time period, Plato tells us exactly the time. He says it's 9600 BC. So then you have to also establish things like, well, could anyone even live in this stupid thing? Even if this is Atlantis, does the time line up? And of course, the time does line up because 9600 is exactly the end of this thing called the Younger Dryas, which is
Yeah.
basically what we would call the end of the last ice age, right?
That's right.
So this is where you have to start saying how much of this is a coincidence, right? And I go through the number we come out with. This thing matches what Plato said, 99.32%. And the only place it was off a little bit is it's supposed to have hot and warm or hot and cold running springs, which is geologically possible, but the springs are not hot and cold right now. And then the measurement to the center island includes a port, and it's supposed to be 50 stadia. And depending on how you measure it, it can be 50 stadia, but also could be just a hair longer. So I took a little bit off for that. But that's it. Otherwise, all those 20 criteria, which I'm happy to go through all of them, they line up. And it's astounding how much they line up. But that's not the end of the story. Because one of the rules that you brought up, which I was smart enough to think before you told me, was we can't just rely on Plato. We got to find some corroborating
Of course.
pieces of information, right? Otherwise, it's just Plato. So there's another guy, ancient Greek, called Herodotus. He wrote the
Yeah.
histories. He's considered, he's considered one of the first trying to be legitimate historians. So the question is, all right, well, if they knew about this Atlantis thing, does he mention it at all? And so, the typical way to go look is you go to some MIT website or whatever, you find the text and you start searching for Atlantis and stuff, and nothing comes up. So I was like, all right, well, that's a bummer. So then I searched for Atlas. And by the way, the mountains to the north on the northern coast of Africa are called the Atlas Mountains.
Yep.
So we know Atlas was the king of Atlantis, and then very close we have Atlas Mountains. So the names, right, they're starting to lock in. And what
They're
Herodotus
really
tells
kind of
us,
it's all starting to come together. Really, when you say it like that, it really kind of comes together. You're putting the pieces together, what you're finding, which is pretty interesting, really, isn't it?
it goes on, and it gets to the point where it's like you get chills. But so Herodotus, he actually does mention Atlanteans, but he spells right now. We spell it like I'm not going to be able to spell off on the fly, but it's like EAN Atlantean, like that. He spells it with an I or something like that. So I was like,
Right.
oh shit, okay. So he mentions Atlanteans and Atlantarians, okay. And he says they're in Libya, which is to the north and east. It is if this thing were to get wiped out, it's where you would go if you just look at a map. And they extend from Libya to the Atlas Mountains. And he said, and this is Herodotus, and he says the Atlanteans are really weird. They refuse to write down their history or their name. They curse the sun. They won't eat meat. They only eat vegetables, and they don't dream.
Oh
So it's
wow.
like, okay, that's a pretty weird people. And then the question is, well, why are they cursing the sun? Well, if you go back to what event might have wiped this thing out, you get into something from the sky. And of course and the other thing is I'm getting way ahead of myself, but there's something called Earth crust displacement, which is not a favorable theory right now. But let's say a big comet hit the ocean, or let's say that the ice caps got too heavy because this is an ice age, and they shifted a little bit, right? Well, if they shifted, the land moves with them, and that can create tsunamis and all that kind of stuff. So it would look like the sun was doing weird stuff. So you've got
Right.
these Atlanteans who exist, and they continue to curse the sun. Okay, that's a legitimate piece of corroboration, but that's not enough. So I'm like, we need something visual. So there's this Ottoman navigator named Piri Reis, and I hope I'm saying that right. and he's from the 1500s, and he commissioned a very famous map, and this map has been in the limelight since like 1995. This guy Graham Hancock put it in his book Fingerprints of the Gods. Now, the big contention with this map is it is said to have been based on earlier world maps, some very old, and all the hoopla about it is the left side of the map seems to show more about the New World, America, South America, the islands, than could have been known by navigators in the 1500s. And
Wow.
then the bottom seems to show the continental shelf as it moves from South America to Antarctica. Um, and you look at it, and it sure does. Now, everything has a critic, and some argue that it's just a distorted version of the very bottom of South America, which it could be too. But there's enough in the map that leads to legitimate confusion and acceptance that it was probably based on earlier maps. And then kooks like me start also believe it might have been based on maps during the Ice Age when the water was lower, because then you can see the continental shelves. So I was like, well, okay, did we see Atlantis on this map? And I've had a picture of this map for like 20 years on my wall. I've stared at it every day. And I looked at it, and I was like, holy shit, the whole friggin' world has been staring at it for 500 years or 600 years. And so if you look at the map on the Africa side, which receives no analysis or interest whatsoever, there is a city in the middle of the circle. So it's on an island surrounded by water, up a river, exactly where this Eye of the Sahara thing is. And in 1500, that's impossible because, I mean, it's just desert, right?
Yeah.
But it's right there. And in the book, I go through how you triangulate the map, and because you've got a little bit of work to do with, you have to find 3 points so we know what they are, because the interior with the, what is that, longitude or latitude? I'm gonna get it wrong. One you can measure by looking at stars. The other you got to have a clock. So it's a little
Yeah.
off. But anyway, you measure it, and sure enough, there's a river right where there would have been a river. And then there's a picture of an elephant, which Plato tells us there were elephants. There are green mountains on this stupid map, which he tells us there are green mountains. And then there's a kooky little city surrounded by water in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Well, there you go, right? I mean,
Wow.
it starts to add up. And then you go back, and then I say those 20 measurements. Every measurement he gives us matches this thing perfectly. It fits a time period where we know the Sahara was green, and we also know that there was a cataclysm, exactly when he says. We found mention of it in another independent historian, Greek historian, Herodotus, and we found it on a map made by the Ottomans 1,500 years later, based on early source maps that seem to show the continental shelves of where the water would have been during the Ice Age. If this isn't, and the thing I say in the book is, since Atlantis can be anything, are people going to be able to accept that it actually is just something? It's just one thing. I mean, here it is. It can't. If this isn't it, it can't be found. It's just nonsense. But it lines up so perfectly. What are the odds, right? What are the odds that all of this would line up exactly? To me, what's interesting, because I'm super excited in my mind, I believe, right, that I found it, but it's also a little disappointing. It's like, okay, well, there it is. It's cool. But yeah, I mean, so that's pretty much, and all this is detailed in the Atlantis Solved book.
Fantastic. That's amazing. I mean, I think, well, obviously you say it's run about the kind of the African side of things. And I think a lot of people think that they don't see what Africa was back in like the ancient times as well, going back to like the ancient Greeks, because I think they've been forgotten about because of what Africa is today, sort of thing. There's a lot of poverty there, there's a lot, but they don't realize the amount of history that's there. When we talk about like the ancient Greeks and the Egyptians, they always forget that obviously you had Ethiopia as well, which is a hugely cultural city as well, a country as well, and you had the majority of North Africa was exactly the same, and they do really forget that they were really involved in the ancient side of stuff as well. So it kind of ties into it a little bit when you were talking there about having Africa as a main point with the Sahara and all that sort of stuff, and it's pretty interesting when you say stuff like that.
Well, here's the thing. The people that talk about Atlantis and people that are, let's say, mainstream academics, it's always viewed as they're in different camps. They don't agree on anything. But if we accept, I have the book in the history of ancient history of West Africa, because I'm like, this changes everything about West Africa. But when you look at the DNA evidence, what's the big, although that's a whole other conversation. But just with DNA, it's all out of Africa, right? People came from Africa. So doesn't it
Yeah.
just make friggin' sense that there'd be a civilization of some level? I mean, this isn't nuclear submarines and spaceships and stuff, but what I think they were really good at, as far as I can tell, is they were really good at agriculture. Plato tells us they were really good at agriculture.
Yeah.
And then when you go to the Atlas Mountains, you see the remnants of ancient agriculture, and they call it steppe agriculture. Now, you see it all over the world, but it had to originate somewhere. And
Of
it
course.
seems to me that when these ancient societies get to a point where they're, in air quotes, advanced, that agriculture is one of the main things we're talking about. We know the Atlanteans weren't very good warriors. They had terrible war tech because they lost to the Greeks of 9600 BC, right? They got beaten back. So that
Yeah.
wasn't their forte. Their forte was growing stuff and probably commerce, but it all came from Africa. And we all know that people, with the current view in science, is that we all came from Africa. So it makes sense. I don't know why it's not heralded as we finally solved it. We finally solved the world. Now the DNA evidence and the historical records all line up. They go back to some appropriate times. One of the other things I point out, I don't know if you know this, there has been 23 species of humans on the planet that we
Okay.
know of. And how hard, rock hard that number is. When the last new species they found was
Go on.
in May. In May, so like 2 months ago. So it was 22. Had we done this last year, I would have said 22. Now it's 23. During
Wow.
this time period, this younger Dryas, 9600 into the last ice age, there was 3 known species of humans on the planet.
So what do you mean when
Isn't
you
that
say
mind
known?
blowing?
Yeah, when you say like known species, I mean, what do you think? Like, obviously, we're like humans, sort of thing, like Homo sapiens and all that. Well, what kind of what's different? What different between them? What differentiates these 23? Is it a lot? Is it are they like kind
Well,
of
you're talking. Okay, have you heard of the Neanderthals? That's the classic example. The
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Neanderthals.
yeah, yeah. That's the old school, like the cavemen sort of thing. Yeah,
Cavemen, yeah, and it goes back, and it goes, and there's been there's this is a whole science and history unto itself. I'm actually working on a new book where I kind of go through this because I think there's a story here that leads to Atlantis, then leads to Plato, and leads to us. But it's just basic. It would be where we're the same species. Well, no, we're I don't even know. I don't know how to phrase it as a scientist, but it'd be like you have dogs, right? So you've got Shih Tzus and you've got German Shepherds and you've got that kind of stuff. They're all dogs,
yeah.
but one's a Shih Tzu, one's a German Shepherd. And I believe that the view is it has some to do with evolution. But then there's also the idea of, when we really look at these Neanderthals, I mean, they seem to have had music and they seem to be just as organized as we are. They're a little shorter and a little wider, a little stronger, heftier. But somehow we beat them. I don't know how that happened. But yeah, there's 23 versions of those. I think the oldest
Wow.
thing. I think when I grew up, there was nothing called the missing link. We didn't know, we hadn't found it. Now they have this thing called Lucy. I don't know. I don't remember the name of what species she's supposed to be, but she's supposed to be a bridge. This is a couple million. They found her skeleton. It's a couple million years old. And it's supposed to be more of a bridge from like chimpanzees to humans. But here's the other interesting thing, because we always say chimpanzees and humans we're part of the same family tree. Well, there's no fossil record of 23 species of chimpanzee. There's just the
Well,
one.
yeah. It's true.
Actually, there might be 2. You know what I mean? So it's just kooky. It's kooky, and you get into lots of things that all point back to Africa. And here we found that Plato knew about Africa, the Egyptians knew about Africa. We have a tale that aligns now geographically. You can use satellite archaeology that matches damn near 100%, 99% to Africa. It was supposed to be an early civilization, and there it is. I mean, and that's kind of the book. That's as far as I go in the book. It's like you go through the math, and here it is. There it is. We got it.
So, what do you,
So,
in your opinion, what do you think happened to it?
well, it says what happened to it. I believe what it said. In fact, there's one picture that I put on the bottom of the cover of the book, and what it is, it looks like a huge tsunami came in, and then probably took a couple years to kind of drain out, but it blew it apart. When you look at the tsunami we just had in Japan, I forget now, 10, 15 years ago, whatever it was, you look at the
Yeah.
magnitude, and it's like getting hit with an atomic bomb in some cases. And Plato actually has this line, which no one talks about, where he's trying to explain all these cataclysms. And here's a line. It says, the country immediately about surrounding the city was a level plain itself, surrounded by mountains which descended towards the sea. Oh, I'm sorry, that's That's the wrong one. Sorry. It says the earth had fallen away all around and sunk out of sight. The consequence is that in comparison of what was then, there are remaining only the bones of the wasted body, as they may be called. As in the case of a small island, all the richer and softer parts of the soil having fallen away, and the mere skeleton of the land being left. Well, I encourage anyone listening, go zoom in on this Richat Structure thing in Mauritania in West Africa. You can't miss it, and that is a description we would write today of it. That is exactly what it looks like. It's been blasted down to the bedrock.
So, I mean, it's like, you obviously you've looked into it. Have you had any sort of like kind of feedback from like kind of people who are like kind of archaeologists and like kind of scholars and all that sort of stuff, or people who are fascinated? What's the feedback? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it, or David, you're full of shit? You're not. This is not right. I mean, what's the feedback you're getting from everyone?
Yeah. So again, because I mentioned we're in camp, so I'm working on two things. I have a documentary pitch in with the Discovery Channel to kind of bring some weight to it and actually explore it in that their 2-hour format. And then as part of that pitch, I went to the University of Florida here, and one of the professors is a professor of West African history. I'm like, let me get this guy involved. And then we had a great conversation up until I said Atlantis, and then he won't take my calls, and he's gone. So it's tough to get mainstreams involved in this. So there's a camp that believes this because they already believe it. There's a camp that doesn't know, and they read it and they're swayed. And then there's the Azores camp that I mentioned, which has they have a leader and they have a following, and they have their reasons why this isn't it, and they're very critical of this because they have a different belief that it's this tiny island in the middle of the Atlantic.
So it's a bit. Do you think it's been? You mentioned about the professor who's obviously not taking your calls because you mentioned Atlantis. Do you think it's because of it's been like diluted over the past? Well, it's been like 300 years since like everyone decided to jump back on it again. Do you think the kind of subject's been really kind of diluted to be more fantasy than anything else?
Yeah, it's a joke. It's a joke. It's a joke subject. It's been beaten to death. And like I said, because the answer has been proposed as anything. I mean, there are people that will argue Atlantis was the United States of America. Maybe, probably not. Or it was Scotland or Ireland because this or that, or and it's like okay, you can argue it, but it's got nothing to do if you actually go back to the primary source material. It's got nothing to do with anything. And if you search for Atlantis, there's probably a headline every 3, 4, 5 years. Many of them academics where they got funding, and they, it'll be every 5 years. Atlantis finally rediscovered. Atlantis was Spain. Atlantis was, this or that, or so. It's just noise. It's just noise to them, and since it changes some of the academic view of history. There is no incentive for an academic to embrace it because they make their money on the current view of history. It's just money. Everything's a product, right? So Atlantis is a product that no one's interested in.
So that is damn Hollywood. Hollywood's ruined it for everyone, isn't it? It's a cash cow now. The bastards. They just want to know what it is so they can make a movie on it, innit? Aquaman. Yeah, let's go make it under the sea.
Yep. Yeah. So they should license my book so I can be a sellout too.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with being a sellout as long as you're getting paid millions of bucks for it. Go for it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I mean, it's just such a fascinating subject, David. I love this. It's great. I mean, the book is the book out now?
Well, yeah, the book's been out. It's been out for about 4 months. Yep. It's actually getting better feedback than I thought. I was a little nervous, like you said, that people would just come in and slam it, just to slam it. But that hasn't been the case. Pleasantly, I've been surprised. I've gotten. If I didn't know what I was stepping into. I've had many people that I might consider folks I would cross the street to not walk past. Contact me.
Tinfoil hats. If you look past my show in my last few episodes, I had one on my show that actually I didn't realise, which I do regret now. So I know exactly who you're talking about.
I know. Look, they're fine. They're good people, but they're really passionate. So I've got that camp, which did surprise me. Then I've got the camp that views this as blasphemy because they believe something else. So I've had death threats over the book.
Wow.
I don't take them yeah, and I even quit answering my phone for a while because they start screaming at you. It's nuts. But you push that aside. The people that actually read it and are interested, just casual readers, very very positive. Matter of fact, the worst review the book has, it was 3 stars, and the lady wrote, "This guy, he basically he couldn't type his way out of a paper bag. He's pretentious, and I don't like reading his work." But yeah, he kind of proved it. So,
That's it. The thing is, if you're not pissing someone off, you're not doing your job right. That's the thing, you know. If you don't get any trolls and haters on your book, you're not doing your job right. That's how I see it.
yeah, yeah. I couldn't believe I had one that was that negative, but actually admitted, yeah, no, the argument holds up. So
It's like
that's
it's
good.
such a backhanded compliment, isn't it? It's like, yeah, the guy's a bit.
Oh,
He's just like, yeah, but he's got a good point. No, I don't like him, but he's got a good point. I love that.
yeah, yeah. I didn't even think it was a backhanded compliment. I just think it was a backhand. I mean, it was not meant to be nice, but I'm reading I'm like, if that's the worst review this book gets, I'm happy. I'm fine.
That's great. That's great. So David, what's happening next with you? What's the plan of action for the rest of the year? You say you've got other books coming. You've got a lot of projects in the pipeline.
Well, yeah, I've written 42 books. I have a
Jesus.
thriller series. I know. I have a thriller series. The last book just came out like a month ago, and I'm starting up a new series. And here's what it's an interesting question. What I've decided to do: more people read my fiction books than read my nonfiction books. Although I write
Yeah.
half and half. So the next book, I'm going to see if I can have a hit. I'm taking the Atlantis story and everything that I've deduced here, and I'm plugging it into my fictional thriller world. So I'm going to kind of do a Da Vinci Code. The main characters are running around. There's a nefarious global organization trying to keep the knowledge suppressed, and they discover the pieces, right, of the Atlantis story. That way, I can make it interesting and compelling. But I'm also trying to get the word out on what we actually know. Kind of I'm like a mini me Dan Brown, I guess would be
I
what I'm
love that
trying to do.
idea. That's such a good idea. That would be amazing. That I love that. I'd read that. And I'm not a big fan of reading, but I would definitely
Okay.
read that. Definitely, that sounds right up my street. I tell you, just
Yeah.
remember when you get that movie rights, right? Okay, can you get involved with that? Definitely.
Oh, I'll make sure we put a podcaster in the movie. We have to have that, right?
Yeah, I'm up for that.
The,
Guess in
the
there.
conspiracy theorist, yeah, who comes in, you have all the knowledge that no one will listen to you, and at the end, you're proven right.
Yay! There we go. There we go. Right, David. David, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. It's been fascinating to obviously describe your findings in the book that you've got. Guys, please go out there and get David's book. I'll put the link in the comments below. Go and find it and go and read it. It's fascinating. If it's anything like this conversation we just had here, your mind's going to be blown. I love that. So, David, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.